Okay, today's Java lesson will be on conditionals, logical operators, and user input. Now, a common programming concept is if statements, and if statements are similar to decisions you make in real life every day. If something is true, then do something. So in the morning you think, if it's raining outside, bring an umbrella, or if there's a test tomorrow, then study today. You can think of it as a true or false question. Is it true that it's raining outside? Then what should I do? Is it true that I have a test tomorrow? Since if statements evaluate true or false values, you can connect them to Boolean variables, since Booleans are either true or false. So if you look at the code, first we are creating a Boolean variable called isChild, which has a value of true. Now we have our if statement. We start with the keyword if. Then in parentheses we put the Boolean we want to evaluate, which is isChild in this case. Now we put whatever code we want to run inside these curly braces. This program will check if isChild is true, and only if it's true will it run the print statement. If it's not true, like if we had originally set this to equal to false, then the program would ignore this whole block of code, this print statement, and just continue with the rest of the program. So what if we wanted a way to check if a Boolean is true and then do something, but if it isn't true, then we want to do something else? This is where if-else statements come in. So in the code, we create a Boolean variable called isChild again, and this time it'll be equal to false. The if will check if isChild is true, and this time it isn't true, so this code where it says print you are a child will not run. Then the program goes to the else statement. It does not evaluate any other variable here, it'll just run if the code in the if statement did not run. So we know the code in the if statement did not run, so the else statement will run, and the program output will be you are not a child. Now what if we wanted to evaluate expressions like checking if a number is less than another number? So let's say we had an integer variable and we wanted to check if its value was less than 2. And if it was, then we wanted to print something. How would we do that? Well, we can start by creating our integer variable called x, which will be equal to 5, and then we create our Boolean variable, which we're going to call x is less than 2, and we're going to place our expression, x is less than 2, right after the equal sign. We know that a Boolean can only store true or false, so what do you think this Boolean stores? Well, x is equal to 5, and we know that 5 is not less than 2, so this expression will be equal to false. This means the Boolean variable only contains false, and it's in the same exact state as if we were to just write false right here. Now we have our if statement, but since the value is false, the print statement will not run. But this seems like a lot. Do we really need to create a Boolean variable every single time we want to compare numbers? We can avoid the whole Boolean variable altogether and just put the expression inside of the if statement. So this code will accomplish the same exact thing, and it avoids using another variable. We have our variable x, and then we just bring our expression right into the if statement, and it'll be evaluated as true or false. And since it's false, it still will not run. Now you might be thinking, if we use an equal sign to assign a value to a variable, like int age equals 20, how do we check if two values are equal? It might be confusing to use an equal sign again, because that's already used for something else. In Java, to check for equality, we use a double equal sign. So a single equal sign is known as the assignment operator, because you're assigning a value to something, and double equal signs is known as the equality operator. So as you can see here, both are used. First we assign 17 to age, and then we check if 17 is equal to age. You have to use the double equal signs just like this, or your program won't run if you had like a single equal sign in this if statement. Now if you wanted to do a less than or equal to sign, you would first have an a less than sign, and then an equal sign. This works for greater than or equal to as well. These are the 6 comparison operators in Java. The first one we just discussed checks if 2 values are equal. The next checks if 2 values are not equal. In Java, the exclamation point is used to mean not, or like the opposite of, and you'll see this again later. And then we have our greater than or equal to, less than, and less than or equal to. Now what if you have an if statement and you wanted to check 2 different things before having your else statement? For example, if you had a story adventure game and the player had 3 choices in their next move, they could either run, hide, or fight. You would need a way to check if they chose run, or if they chose hide, or if they chose fight. This is where you'd use an else if statement. In this example, we'll think of the choices as numbers. So run corresponds to 0, hide corresponds to 1, and fight corresponds to 2. If the first condition is true, that is, if choice equals 0, then print you chose run. Otherwise, if the first one is not true, then check if the second one is true, and that is, if choice is equal to 1. In this case, it is, so you chose hide will be printed out. Now the program will stop checking the rest of the block, because one of the conditions was already met. The else ifs are only checked if every condition before it was false. So if this if statement was true, then this would not be checked, and this would not be checked either. So here's a complete if-else statement with all 3 components. We have an integer variable called age, which is set to 14. If age is less than 13, then we're going to print you are a child. Else, if age is less than 18, print you are a teenager. This teenager line will only be printed if age is greater than or equal to 13 and less than 18. This is because age can't be less than 13 at this point in the program, because if it was, then this if statement would be called and none of this would run. And finally, if age is not less than 18, then we're going to print you are an adult. The else statement is always the last case scenario, so just like an else if statement, this will only run if everything before it did not run. And if everything before it did not run, the else statement will always run. So here are some important things to remember about if statements. One is you cannot have an else statement or an else if statement without an if statement first. Both of these must come after an if statement. You also do not need an else statement or an else if statement. You can use an if statement if you wanted to, or you could have just an if and an else if, or you could have just an if and an else. Next, you can have as many else if statements as you want, but you can only have one else statement for every if statement. Else statement is like a final option, and you cannot have multiple final options. And the else statement must be after all else if statements, so the else statement is always at the end. Now you can also have nested if statements. So let's say you had 2 integer variables x and y, which are equal to 15 and 20 respectively. You use an if statement to check if x is greater than 10, and if it is, then you move on to the condition inside of it, which is whether or not y is greater than 10. If y is greater than 10, then print that both values are greater than 10. Otherwise, we're still in the scenario where x is greater than 10. Since y is not greater than 10, that means only x is greater than 10. But if that first condition of x is greater than 10 is not true, meaning x is less than or equal to 10, none of this will be checked. The program will instantly go to the else statement right here. Now inside the else statement, it's the same thing as before. We know x is less than 10, and now we want to check y. If y is greater than 10, then only y is greater than 10, and that's what we print. But if that's not true, that means y is less than or equal to 10, and it's also x which is less than or equal to 10, so we print x and y are both less than or equal to 10. Now what if we wanted to check if both x and y are greater than 10? You can use a nested if statement like this, but it seems like a lot just to check 2 conditions. What if we wanted to check 3 or 4 conditions? Then we'd have to have 3 nested if statements, and it'll get messy really fast. We can use logical operators instead. In one if statement, we can connect multiple conditions using ampersands to indicate and, or 2 vertical bars to represent or. These 2 pieces of code will do the same exact thing. The bottom one is checking if x is greater than 10 and y is greater than 10 all in one line. If we replace these ampersands with vertical bars like this, then it would be checking if x is greater than 10 or y is greater than 10, and then it would be printing x or y is greater than 10. Now we're going to talk about getting user input. Okay, so the way we'll be getting user input is through Scanner. You'll understand the underlying details behind Scanner in a future lesson when we cover classes and objects, but for now just memorize this code. You start by importing the scanner into your program. Import is used to allow you to access Java packages, which is official Java code that has already been written by somebody else, and you can use it at any time. We don't want to create our own way of getting user input, just like how if we were making a website, we wouldn't want to recreate the internet. It's usually better to utilize something that already exists if you can. So we import the Java scanner, and then we have the boilerplate Java code, which we talked about before. And inside the public static curly braces, we have scanner input equals new scanner system.in. The word input is just the name of the variable that we'll reference to later. So if you wanted, you could name this keyboard or just scanner. Then we use a simple print statement telling the user to enter a number. Then we create an integer variable and type input, which is the name of the scanner, .nextInt. This will get whatever integer value the user typed after this print statement was printed. And then whatever the user typed, it'll store it in the integer variable x. So then it'll print out your number was, and then whatever the user entered. Now you may have noticed that the previous example asked the user for an integer, and it couldn't have accepted anything else like a string or a double. This is how you would get those data types. It's really uncommon to get a boolean from the user, and the most common will probably be a string, integer, and double. You don't really get chars either. Now these are some exercises to reinforce what we learned. I encourage you to try these out for yourself, and as always, if you have any questions, you can join our Discord server and get help there. The link will be in the description.